We've been talking a lot about change. Absolutely, things are changing. Customers are more informed, more empowered, more knowledgeable, more vocal. Employees in the next generation are much more technically literate than we are and are no longer willing to accept doing mindless work that was designed by others. They want to be part of creating their own work and creating their own working together environment with others in organizations. And we're on the threshold, I think, of really exploring the full implications of the materials and the communications technologies. And we still don't know quite what those outcomes are going to be. So we're in a time of exploration and a time where we could waste a tremendous amount of money on the wrong choices. So it's a time also where the environment is becoming a much, much more visible consequence of our actions. And so I would argue that in such a time, we can no longer forget people. Focusing on technology and exploiting those technical opportunities is absolutely right. But ignoring people is a big mistake, because it's people that manage and cope with and respond to change. So ultimately, lean is a pointer, is a direction, is a signal, is an inspiration to a people-centric way of organizing that I believe is the organizational framework we need for the future, for this time of rapid change. So the real promise of lean, it's still to be realized. We still have to work on it. It's not fixed, because it's a way of thinking, and it's a set of ideas and ways of looking at the world that translate into very different actions that have very different consequences. So actually, lean is a people-centric management system for our time and for the future. Sure, it has a history. Sure, we can look back and see why our misconceptions of lean early on were often wrong. But now I think we can begin to see the deeper thought process that underlines lean, and it's about people-centric management systems that are focused on solving user needs, that are focused and built about creating meaningful work for all of our employees, not just a few. And it's one in which, in a time of experimentation and the danger of spending too much money on the wrong things, it's a time when we can also save a tremendous amount of time, of capital, and resources, and therefore minimize our impact on the environment. And at its core, lean is a learning system, as we've heard. And it builds a capability throughout the entire organization of learning faster than our competitors. So lean is actually builds the infrastructure, the mental models, the ways of working together that create the conditions for continuous innovation rather than a few spectacular big leaps. So that continuous innovation, I think, is the actual consequence of a different way of thinking. But our challenge, our real challenge, is if we continue to see lean, or what people describe as lean, through traditional management thinking, and simply adopt tools of lean and try and implement them with the traditional thinking, we shouldn't be surprised if we don't just get traditional results. Only if the thinking changes will those tools, those techniques, those perspectives generate the results that Lean promises. So after working with a group of CEOs who went through many Lean programs of their own and ultimately came to the conclusion they had to lead their own Lean transformations actively, personally, we gradually became able to distill what it takes to actually lead Lean. And that has been the missing element in our deep understanding of Lean. And we discover that Lean is actually a strategy. Lean is a strategy of building dynamic gains from finding and solving the right problems. It's not about buying best practice and optimizing it. It's about engaging everybody in continuous improvement, continuous accelerating improvements, focused on solving the right problems. That's essentially what real strategy is about. And we discovered, too, that leading a lean, people-centric organization is all about learning. And I think we've all come to that conclusion ourselves. But the missing piece also was, well, how do you translate learning into bottom-line results? If learning is simply nice to have, fun to do, it's not going to convince the finance directors or the boards of directors or your shareholders. We can translate learning onto the bottom line. So that's our challenge. And these are the obstacles to that way of thinking that we need to create in the future. We need to learn our way into, think our way into a new way of acting. So what's the problem? And you might reflect on whether you see these characteristics in your organization. First of all, as we're taught in business schools by Michael Porter and others, strategy is what the board and the CEO need to think about. And it's all about positioning in marketplaces, choices of the right technologies, how you compete against competitors. And that's completely separate. If you watch Michael Porter's videos, it's completely separate from execution. Execution is all about just buying best practice, finding the right smart people, the right locations, the lowest cost solutions, and it's all about just buying that best practice. And it's not the job of CEOs and the board and leaders. So that's interesting. You just buy best practice and you force it in. And so what happens, of course, is that leaders have been taught it is not their job to be actively engaged in the execution, in operations, in delivery, in making products. That's best practice that they commission others to implement for them. So the consequence is that leaders have been taught it's not their job to be actively leading change at the front line, whether it's the design office or whether it's the customer interface or whether it's the production or service delivery point. So not surprisingly, leaders have not been involved. They have been traditionally used to asking outside or internal experts to solve their problems for them. That's what they've been taught to do. Surprise, surprise, Lean takes a very different view. Second, we discover that actually traditional accounting the accounting systems that we use to make decisions actually can't see the problems that are facing the processes and the front line every day. And can't see the problems, but also can't track the improvements to solve those problems. They are invisible in the accounting systems. So we have to fundamentally change the way we think about constructing the metrics that define the gaps, that track the physical changes that will close those gaps, that will lead to bottom line results. So we fundamentally have to rethink the metrics by which we make decisions. And we've been used to processes and systems designed by experts. And that is how we think about the world. Leaders commission experts to solve their problems and design processes, better processes, and line management and middle management's job is essentially making sure that those people-free processes, they're designed so anybody can basically operate them, are complied with. So that's a kind of policeman role. And that's the source of great deal of frustration, but also means the focus is on static optimization with no learning. That is no longer acceptable to the workforce of the future, quite apart from the fact that it actually kills and stifles learning, which is what we want. Silos and rule-based bureaucracies. I've said many times, and I've been unpopular in saying this, but most of the waste, the expensive waste in organizations is not at the front line. It's at headquarters. It's bright people fighting PowerPoint wars over departmental and silo budgets. You may not have that in your organization, but I suspect that you do. And the truth is that bureaucracy was a tremendous innovation, no question, a German innovation largely. But actually it is so powerful in restricting and in resisting change that we need to find, and we're never going to get rid of it, but we need to find countermeasures to counter the inherent resistance of silos and bureaucracies to change. The consequence of not being able to see what's really going on in the organization, because the numbers don't tell you, a leadership that is disengaged, and silos fighting for budgets, is that every management team has long lists. I've seen them everywhere, 60 to 80 projects on their to-do lists. And that simply tells me that they don't have the confidence that any of those projects are necessarily going to succeed. And so therefore, launching a lot of projects, some of them might succeed, hopefully. But we don't know which ones, and we don't know when. So a lean organization is much better able to see the fundamental problems, define the improvement directions, and to focus efforts on closing the gaps. But the deepest source of problems with traditional thinking is traditional top-down decision-making. Very interesting. Traditional top-down decision-making is the core of the way we look at the world. And all of those things I've enumerated are consequences of that top-down decision-making. So we need to challenge all of these, including the way we make decisions. So let's start there. Top-down decision-making, you all do it, we all do it, is either the opinion of the most highly paid person in the room, or it's the result of things they've heard at conferences, detailed analysis of data, of past data, and so on, that creates a vision for where the organization needs to go. So it's about defining what it is the organization needs to do, and then constructing a plan. And then constructing a plan of action in detail with targets and rollout and all the rest of it. And then it's given over to those to execute in the organization, to drive it through the organization, and then somehow to deal with the consequences. There are always many consequences. Because as military strategists tell you, no plan survives the first contact with the enemy. Events are always different. Planning is everything. Plans are worthless, as Eisenhower said many, many years ago. So however much we plan, we don't know how reality is going to turn out. And we don't know really what the consequences are going to be. So it's actually a bankrupt and fundamentally flawed decision-making process. It's called jumping to solutions. It's fast thinking. If you've understood that and followed Kahneman's slow and fast thinking, it's jumping to solutions with really minimal evidence of what's really going on, because the bureaucracy hides the evidence, because it doesn't want to be blamed. So it's fundamentally flawed, and it's inherently wasteful. And it's very interesting that in the military, the experience time and time again has been, as Eisenhower said, plans are everything, but planning is worthless. Planning is everything, but plans are worthless. And so there is a movement in the military strategists field, a lot of different experiments going on to actually lead from the ground up, as they call it. Developing the front line and building the capabilities on the front line to deal with whatever circumstances they find at the time quickly, without having to go right back up the organization and develop a plan, to do the right thing at the right time. So it's about empowering, upskilling the front line, and they call it leading from the ground up. That sounds a more promising way of thinking. And indeed, that is very much what lean thinking is all about. Lean thinking starts not in the office. Lean thinking starts at the front line. I'll go into it in deep detail in a minute. And it's about leaders finding not just the immediate problems, but the underlying causes of those immediate problems, and then being able to very clearly define the gap that needs to be closed and the improvement direction that needs to be followed. And that needs to be articulated in a way that everyone in the organization can see how they will contribute, how they can contribute to making this improvement direction happen. Construct the right experiments, carry out PDCA problems, classic problem solving. This is problem finding, which is the step before problem solving. We know how important problem solving is, to frame the problems, to frame the experiments, to learn from the experiments, and then gradually over time to form lasting solutions that tackle the root causes. This is actually the path of the sensei. All of those leaders found they needed a sensei, somebody who'd seen it before, either as a CEO or as a very deep, experienced lean practitioner, who could lead their thought process, because this is an individual process of learning for leaders just as much as it is for the teams in the rest of the organization. And the sensei is basically helping the leaders learn this different way of thinking that, as I said, the military call learning from the ground up, leading from the ground up. So this is a very different way of thinking. Instead of the big bang, we need a solution, a new solution, go away and design it and implement it, which we will continue to do. Don't get me wrong. But this is a different thought process, which is, let us look at what we've got now, let us engage people in improving that, and by doing that, we will see the improvement directions that we need to follow in the future. And we can build the capabilities throughout the organization to make those changes happen and fight the silo-based bureaucracies. Let's take those one at a time. So finding the right problems. You can only find these problems by going to the front line, going to the design office, going to the customer interface, going to the production site, going to the warehouse, going to distribution. It's only at the front line that you see the real problems that prevent people implementing the systems that you've imposed, that you commissioned, and they are broken, that don't always work because multiple complex systems have a probability of failure. And there will always be interruptions, and people will be dealing with those. How can you learn from the way people deal with those interruptions? And by doing that, you're showing a commitment to learning, not only your learning, but also their learning. But the real value of leaders going and helping and supporting the front line in learning is that leader begins to see actually the underlying problems that often have been the result of their decisions that they need to address to remove these as obstacles in the future. So leaders learn by helping others learn. Leaders learn to see the underlying problems and then see the capabilities that are necessary to solve those problems. And maybe challenging some of their previous management practices in doing so. So finding the right problems is a fundamental starting point. And setting improvement directions rather than setting targets. Let us set improvement directions. At so-and-so, a 50% reduction in defects per year, a 50% reduction in lead time, etc., etc. What is the rate of change that we want to set? And communicate that in a way that everyone can see how they can contribute to it. And then translate those into physical changes, into the product design, into the process design, into the customer interaction that will deliver system-wide results. Being very clear what the business case is for those actions. Improved quality, faster time to market and innovation is the core of growing sales. Reducing the total lead time and increasing the flow from the time from order to cash saves cash. What are you going to do with that cash? Repeat Kaizen reduces the cost base of your existing production, and it frees up space for new products, for this growing complexity of products that we've heard about earlier. So it frees up capital, saves capital by using our existing resources. So clear business directions, clear business consequences. And now we see when we get to the third stage, how do we design the experiments to be done to make those physical changes happen? This is what the Toyota production system is all about. It's not a production system, it's a learning system. It's a way of framing learning in an organization. And most of us have forgotten the TPS house, the Toyota Production System house. In a nutshell, on the right-hand side, the judoka pillar is all about deepening individual, technical, and organizational capability for doing the work. Making it visual, tracking quality at source, etc., etc. On the left side, you have the ability then to create a rhythm, to flow things at the rate pulled by the customer and so on. That's the collaborative skills that are necessary. You can't have one without the other, and neither of them makes sense without visibly changing the offer to the customer. And the foundation on which that is built is stable teams, is employees capturing their knowledge, their improvements in standards, and using those standards as a baseline for improvements, for proper scientific improvements, classic PDCA problem solving as we're used to. And the underpinning of that is confidence between management and the teams to support them, challenge them, but to provide all the resources they need to complete their task every day. There's a tremendous depth to this. It is the core of this learning process. I urge you to study it again. Because this is what helps to frame the learning for every single action we take, not just to solve that problem, but to learn how to think to solve the next problem, and the next problem, and the next problem. So very interesting. TPS is a learning system, and it always has been, and we've thought about it as a bunch of tools. And we realize, too, that experiment after experiment sometimes works, sometimes doesn't. We learn from those experiments. And gradually, through repeated experiments, we capture reusable knowledge that works, in standards. And capability building is learning to solve tomorrow's problems, not just solving today's problems, because you can end up solving today's problems again and again and again. Capability building is each team learning to solve tomorrow's problems, which means it's not about optimizing or rolling out best practice, which is the traditional way we've thought about implementing lean. It's about building capabilities to solve tomorrow's problem. The sensei is not interested in your solution. The sensei is interested in what did you learn from going through that problem-solving process. That should tell us something. So this is a very different way of thinking about leadership, a way of thinking about learning, and a way of thinking about building knowledge through learning that translates into business results. So, 2 slides to summarize. It's about recognizing that processes, increasingly complex processes, increasingly automated, fine by me, absolutely fine, are going to be a set of activities, each with their own probability of failure. But the more integrated they are, the more the consequences of those failures will be felt across the system. Those integrated systems are always going to rely on human decision-making and judgment to cope with situations that were not expected to occur. So instead of designing people-free processes, we need to design processes where judgment can balance the freeing up of resources through automation. So people-centric processes, bear that in mind. And bear in mind this fundamentally changes the role of frontline and lean and line management. Because it's line management's task no longer to police people doing the work that was designed by others. Line management is there to build capabilities through daily practice and learning by doing. And leaders' role, and this is not easy for a society that respects knowledge and authority as much as you do in Germany. It's about leading by asking questions rather than telling people what to do. Telling people what to do takes away their responsibility for learning and thinking about and proposing solutions to a problem. So it's a very different Socratic way of thinking and leading. And this respect for people, which is the absolute heart of Toyota's approach, is on the one hand about challenging them to do more, to achieve more, to learn more, and it's also about supporting them in doing that. And finally, as I said at the beginning, the true benefit, business benefit of lean is continuous innovation. We are now in a situation where in every industry we're moving away from big bang projects, occasionally launching a project, a new product or a new service. We're now much more in this scale-up phase where we learn to improve day by day our products and services. Learn from the digital world. They are constantly releasing updates every day. Not every 6 months as we used to for big SAP systems. They're doing it every day, improving modules all the time. So this continuous experimentation and feedback from users is the world we live in now and the world we will live in the future. Building those communication links with users is going to be fundamental to building continuous innovation. So that's the loop with the customer. As we go back through the organization, we have been very poor at accumulating the experience from the continuous improvement, both in our production operations and design operations in our supply base, and translating those into the next generation product. So how do we accumulate the Kaizen experience, add it to the technical experience of those seeking new technology? How do we feed that into the next generation products? Phenomenal potential that we are missing. And how do we do this on a continually faster tack time? So the tack time of releasing, as I've already said in digital technology, has gone from the yearly release, daily release, to daily release. What is the tack time for releasing new improvements to your products and services? I think it will ultimately be daily, but it's certainly not every few years. And two elements to making this work are absolutely critical. One is the judgment for each iteration, what needs to change and what stays the same. Otherwise, engineers want to redesign everything every time. Of course they do. But the real judgment is what is the necessary change for this next iteration that we're going to experiment with and get the feedback from, and what do we not change? So it's the judgment about, and it's a personal judgment built out of years of experience, and it has to be embodied in a person. In Toyota case, the chief engineer, who makes that judgment as to what goes forward into the next generation product, supported by a parallel evolution of the technical capabilities on which he or she can draw. Supported by, rather than dominated by. So the voice of the customer, voice of the product, voice of the service is now strongly represented and driving continuous improvement, and technology is absolutely, including digital technology, is supporting it. So if we see this as a system, and we see this as a learning system all the way up and down, and we see it translating, giving that learning back to the customer, then we've begun to understand what the true potential of lean. So we've tried to capture this different approach to leading and decision making in a book we've literally just published in the United States, and it's just in English in Europe. A different approach to decision making, finding the right problems, framing improvement directions, supporting learning, leading from the ground up, as the strategists have taught us. That's the subject of our latest book. And I don't think this is the end of the lean story. I think it is another big piece that was missing. I think other people from the next generation in the digital generation are going to add a lot more to the lean story for the future. So lean thinking evolves. but it has deep roots, going way back as an alternative way of making decisions and leading organizations. So that's my contribution. I hope that thinking leads you to a different way of doing. Best of luck. Thank you very much indeed.